welcome to another edition of That Catholic Saints Guy. I'm your host, Brian O'Neill, and today we're going to talk with John Dijak and Father Eugene Ritz of the Diocese of Allentown. And we're going to talk about a priest who has had an enormous impact on the lives of all three of us, and that is Father Walter Ciszek, whose cause for beatification is going forward. If you're familiar with him at all, you're familiar with him because he's the author of not only With God in Russia, but also probably most notably, He Leadeth Me, which has changed millions of lives of anyone, it's changed the life really of anyone who's ever read the book. And that certainly is the case with me. John and I were talking earlier, it's the case with him. And speaking of which, John, why don't you welcome to the show and why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much, Brian. It's a privilege to be with you today. I first became acquainted with Father Ciszek as a senior in high school, as you said, reading He Leadeth Me. And he's always been a companion and really one of the saints that I would say is most accompanied me in my life. I'm the father of 8, a husband of 1. I am currently the president of Father Gabriel Richard High School in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and an attorney, write a little bit every now and again, and usually enjoy teaching, quite frankly. So I started out as a Latin teacher, and now I'm in administration, but that makes sense given the brood I have to take care of. So so that's kind of the story of my life in a nutshell there. So
fantastic. And Father Ritz, how is it that you've come to this great effort of trying to beatify Father? First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, and maybe a little bit about how you came to have a vocation to the priesthood.
Sure. Well, like Father Walter, I grew up in the anthracite coal regions of Northeast Pennsylvania, where his story is very well known and he is very much loved. So growing up, the cause of Father Ciszek was well known even through my own high school years at one of our Catholic high schools, Marian Catholic, in the area, where his cause was known and promoted. In entering the seminary and praying and finding that vocation, I was given the book With God in Russia. And I remember reading that in the minor seminary. And in the course of studies there, I remember thinking to myself, as he was describing his own experience in the minor seminary and in the novitiate, I remember thinking to myself that if this man lived down the hall from me, I would probably think he was crazy, you know, in the way that he describes himself in those years. But as you see the book unfold, you gradually understood that God used even the difficult parts of his personality, what you would even maybe consider his flaws. God used them and made good work of them in his own vocation. And that really became a focus for me, that God will use not only maybe the good things you have to present, but also those flaws and difficulties. And then later on, reading With God in Russia, He Leadeth Me, which was so profound and spiritually moving in terms of what he faced. After ordination, I was an assistant pastor for a number of years, and I worked also full-time in Catholic education, which was a great privilege, at 2 of our high schools. In the meantime, worked part-time and then full-time for a canon law degree, which brings me to this. I currently serve in our diocesan tribunal canonical services office, and as part of that was very privileged to be appointed the co-postulator for the cause, having some knowledge of the process and through which it works.
Well, I think what you both have just said and what I was alluding to before is kind of like what C.S. Lewis once remarked: you can never be too careful about what you read. All 3 of us have read books by Father Ciszek, and all 3 of us have been profoundly impacted by him. And it's not because he was some great writer, it's because he has so much to teach us about what it means to walk with Christ and how we can really grow so much closer to God. Tell me, gentlemen, what is it that you think recommends him towards being a saint in our time? And John, why don't we go ahead and start with you first?
Sure. There's so many things, but I think he is the saint of every man. He really is. And what I mean by that is he lived a very full life. And he was a rapscallion as a kid, and he a troublemaker. And so he knows what it's like. He knows what it means to struggle in whatever area. And I think that's something that's a common human experience for all of us. We all know what it means to struggle in some area of our life, some point of difficulty that we might have. And so his perseverance, his always getting back up and starting over again and relying on God in order to do that, and recognizing that impulse to start over again comes from God. He never gave up. And I think that's such a message, especially for young people today, but for everybody, whether it's in a marriage, trying to figure out what you want to do, your vocation. His story can speak to every class of person and every personality type, and especially to young people too, I think. And so in a nutshell, I think he's the saint of every man. That's how I would phrase it.
Father, what about you? What recommends him to sainthood in your eyes?
There are so many things. John, you hit on one so important, that identifiability. I would take that, just build on that and take it a step further in one way, and then one other notion. The way I would look at that is not only individually is he the saint for every man, but I would also say he would be the saint to respond to the culture that we face here and now, for a couple of reasons. His life calls us to missionary zeal, and it reminds us that we don't have to be missionaries in some foreign place or place that exists in global trauma, but he calls us to be missionaries in the places that we live and that we work and we gather. So I think he's relevant in that sense. But even a step further, I would say that he faced the threat of communism head on. He knew communism through and through. He knew the evils of communism. He lived it day in and day out in his confinement and in his work. I think that he gives us the response to the relativism that we face today. But, a generation or two ago, it was that threat of communism, which is still so present. But now this indifferent secular relativism that so plagues our culture. We find, especially you mentioned young people, we find young people searching and looking for something desperately beyond themselves, that sense of fulfillment, that which will satisfy the deepest parts of their being. And we find such an emptiness that they're looking for because their culture is telling them there are no moral absolutes. Everything devolves to opinion. And I think if we face the relativism of our age the way he faced the communism of his age, he provides us, in a sense, with that cure, that friendship with Christ that tells us that we can know what is good, we could know what is true, and furthermore, we can act on it. And we can take that message to others, because ultimately it's that friendship and love of Christ that he experienced that allows us to be fulfilled and live out the vocations that God is calling us to. And just secondly, briefly, we need the witness of holy and heroic priests. We need the heroic witness of all Catholics, of all that follow the Christian faith, but in a particular way, given everything and every trauma that the church has experienced, Father Walter is one of those men that we can uphold to say, look at how he did this. Look at the circumstances he faced. Look at how his faith was tested. Look at his heroic virtue and hold him as an example for priests of every age and as example for people to know the holiness and the heroic virtue that exists and is made possible in and through a vocation to the priesthood.
Father, let's continue with you for a little bit here. Why don't you tell us his story? And since you grew up in the same area and you've walked the same paths, and then John, if you want to interject and tell us, maybe color. Let's put it this way: Father Ritz will be the play-by-play announcer, and you'll be the color commentator. How's that?
Perfect. This will be great. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just try to hit major highlights. He was born on the feast of St. Charles Borromeo in the early 20th century, the son of Polish immigrants in a little town called Shenandoah, Pennsylvania.
Very fitting. Okay.
And truly a coal mining town in its day. And when he grew up there, he grew up at St. Casimir's Parish there. He, I think, skipped as much school as he attended. John, I think that might be an accurate statement.
I think that's absolutely right, yeah.
And it had to shock, I think it really had to shock everyone, especially his family, when he announced his intentions that God was calling him to be a priest. You know, here was a young man whose father walked him forcibly to the police station and asked the police to send him to reform school because he was so disobedient to his parents. I love that story. And here he is off to train at St. Cyril and Methodius Seminary in Orchard Lake, Michigan, near Pontiac, Michigan, a place known for its cold winter temperatures, a place where he continued to try and prove himself this tough guy. I love the story, though, about how he came to the Jesuits, because it just shows his young personality and the way he would go about things. He read the life of St. Stanislaus Kostka, and following St. Stanislaus, who himself had, how should I say, a bit of the same disposition in him, walking all those miles to become a Jesuit, he identified with him and found something in him that he wanted to emulate. And so instead of telling the seminary rector or his spiritual director or even his family or his parents, he boarded a train at the end of the semester, and instead of going home, went to the Jesuit novitiate in upstate New York and would not leave until they accepted him. Having never met a Jesuit, literally went and knocked on their door. In his training for the Jesuits, of course, we see Pope Pius XI, a diplomat, seeing what's happening in Russia, seeing the society and culture falling apart. And we see that call for the Jesuits to, as missionaries and educators, to go into Russia, to minister to the needs of the people that were there. And he knew this would involve learning a whole other rite in terms of liturgy, 2 additional languages, one to celebrate the liturgy in and one to preach in and speak and converse in. He knew it would mean more training. He knew it would be harder. And I think that was God using his personality saying, I'll do the harder thing.
Let me interrupt real quick. Was he an only child, or did he have brothers and sisters as well?
I believe two sisters, John. Am I correct in that?
One of 13 kids. 2 of them, the sisters you're referring to, Father, are the
religious. I'm sorry, the religious sisters.
That's
yes.
right. Yeah, exactly.
2 religious sisters. Wow. Okay.
Forgive me. Yes, we had 2 religious sisters and then a number of other siblings.
So in other words, he grew up in a household with absolutely no faith whatsoever. You know, I mean, a household that produced 1 priest and 2 religious sisters. That's not a bad thing. That's pretty good. That's a good track record.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So anyway, he gets called, he feels this call to go be with the Russian people. What prompted that vocation? Or that vocation within a vocation?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Father. He was when he was in seminary at Orchard Lake, but prior to going to the Jesuits, Pius XI had the call to start the Rusicum, so this Russian institute at the Pontifical Oriental Institute, or Institute for Eastern Christian Studies, basically, in Rome. And what it was to answer the very pressing need for priests and religious to minister to the people in Russia who were then recently under the communist domination. Subsequent studies have shown this is kind of a death sentence in many ways. You're risking these men's lives going into Russia, where it's a very murderous regime. But Pius XI was very undeterred in doing this. And so when he kind of announced this general call, and it wasn't specifically at first to the Jesuits, but it became kind of a Jesuit thing, Walter Chiswick, the young Walter Chiswick, was very fired by the idea, and he maintained this even through his time in his Jesuit formation, writing letters to the superior general and whatnot. until finally he was approved to go to the Russian Institute, learn, as Father said, learn the language, learn the different rites that he would be, the Eastern rites of the church in order to celebrate the sacraments. And ultimately, he says so beautifully in He Leadeth Me, he just had this soul-satisfying peace whenever he returned to that. This was something he wanted to do, and it was a cooperation with God and his will. And so that's what fired him up to do this. And ultimately, he was sent in the 1938, 39, I believe, into Russia as a kind of common laborer and, undercover, almost James Bond-like in one sense.
Now, we should probably explain for viewers, when we talked about having to learn a whole different rite, a whole different way of doing the liturgy, it's because while the main part of the Catholic Church, it does use the Latin rite, the rite that developed from out of Rome, but there are 23 other, and if I've got the number wrong, please correct me, but there are 23 other rites, most of them in the East, and they use, by and large, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the Mass developed by him, or the Divine Liturgy, as they call it, developed by him. And so it's not going to be just the same Mass that you and I would, or that the average Catholic is going to see on any given Sunday. Even if they went to the, say, traditional Latin Mass, it's going to be something completely different. Lots of similarities, lots of prayers are the same, but in and of itself, the rite is different. So he goes over, and he's in a place called, he writes that he's in Albertine, Poland. If you go to a map today and look for a town called Albertine, or Albertina even, in Poland, you're not going to find it. Why is that?
It's actually in Belarus now. So the
border shifted with the war, I'm guessing.
Correct. And so so that's a probably more Russian influence, the Polish-Russian border, and these various other areas. Modern day Albertine is in Belarus, and so that's why you wouldn't see it right now. But even when it was under within the Polish boundaries, if you will, politically, it was still kind of a frontier town. And so you had two churches there. You had the Latin Rite parish, so the Roman church that you just described, Brian, but you also had the Eastern Rite, or the Byzantine parish as well. And the Jesuits kind of had an outpost, like a novitiate there. So they ministered to both of these folks as parish priests, but they also taught and a number of other things. So that was like the point of contact before the actual formally going into Russia.
So then he gets he goes over there, the war comes, and during the war, he finds his way across the border in Russia as a common laborer. Where does this take place, and why does this happen?
Father?
Sure. Well, there was the way I've always read it, there was a caravan of refugees, essentially, that he joined on to. He had paperwork provided to him, I believe, through various sources, including ecclesiastical sources, that helped him work his way in. He was, when you talk about James Bondish, his papers at this point, I believe, referred to him as Vladimir Lipinski, a common laborer who was widowed and without children. And he just joins the refugees and gets into the boxcar for what I can't imagine what that trip was like. And he travels there into the mountains in Russia, if I have that part of the story correct.
And Father, if I could add a little color, as Brian wants me to, one of the other interesting kind of James Bond-esque things was the papers that he got, that he and another Jesuit went in to ensure that they were their true identity would be verified later on. The Archbishop of Lvov in the Ukraine, Cardinal Sheptycki, I believe his name was, or at the time Archbishop, took a piece of out of a book, divided it into four, gave each of them a piece, and said, this will be our way of understanding and knowing whether or not you are who you are, or that you were in a certain place, or it needed to communicate. So the stuff we see in the movie, sometimes it has a basis in real life. So another fascinating just a little element.
John Paul, when he was ordaining priests from the Czech, or from what was then Czechoslovakia, did the same thing. Would send part of a postcard. He would have the other. When they would meet up, he would show his part of the postcard. So there you have it.
Yeah, fascinating.
So he gets over there and he starts ministering to people, and it's his dream come true, right? It's everyone wants to have him give them the spiritual food of the sacraments and all these sorts of good things. Is that correct?
Sort of. Let's say at that point he was living out a vocation within a vocation within a vocation. I mean, first there's this call to the priesthood, then there's this call to religious life, specifically the Jesuits, and then within the order, as John, you mentioned, the letters to the superior, the vocation to go into Russia. So he does finally arrive there. He does begin ministering, working as a common laborer. And it's not terribly long, maybe about a year or so until he's arrested.
Yep.
Okay, so why was he arrested? And on what charge?
The secret police at the time, the NKVD, knew him, found him out to be a priest. And remember the segment of With God in Russia, where they sit him down and he tries to tell them, I'm Vladimir Lipinski, and showing them his papers and things like that. And they looked at him and said, you're Walter Ciszek, you're a Catholic priest, and you're a spy for the Vatican. So the first two things were true. And how they ever came to know that, I'm not sure we know.
Well, and when you understand that he was there under false pretenses, using a false identity, you can understand why they would think that he was this Vatican spy. It makes perfect sense when you put it in that context.
Yeah, I think there were, you read this in the book, especially with God in Russia, the three musketeers, right, that he refers to, the two other Jesuits who were his buddies that they really hung out with in their training. First of all, he uses even in With God in Russia, those aren't their real names, because when With God in Russia was published, it was still the time of the Cold War. He didn't know where these guys ended up. So he didn't want to get them in trouble. So even there, their real names, instead of Moskva, instead of Makar, it was Moskva. And instead of, what was the other guy's name, Father? Do you remember?
Oh my goodness, it's escaping me at the moment.
Yeah, but it's the one he went into Russia with. But in any event, what ended up happening was in a subsequent study done on the Rusicum and the priests who went into Russia and what happened to them, and et cetera, it turns out Moskva was the one who did not go into Russia. Instead, he was sent by Archbishop Sheptytsky of Lvov back to Rome just to report to the Vatican as to, okay, two of our guys went in, and here's the report, et cetera. He ended up getting stopped by the NKVD in his travels over there, and was subsequently shot in July of 41 or something to that effect. And that squares roughly with the time that Ciszek and can't believe I'm missing his name, but anyway, his other colleague were not only found out, but how they could have his name, the dossier, where he was an American Catholic priest, etc. All of that they speculate came from Moskva before he was killed. So that again, I don't think it's metaphysically certain that was the case, but given the timing and everything else, that seems to be the case. And they were quite ruthless, obviously. So
what happens to him after his arrest?
He's confined in Lubyanka for the next 5 years.
And the Lubyanka, just so people know, was run by the KGB back then, as you noted, was called the NKVD, and it was just a place of it was the sort of thing that probably mothers would tell their children, don't eat your peas, go ahead, but you'll end up in the Lubyanka.
Well, what's interesting about that very place is a couple of things there. It was an old hotel, to my knowledge, and when you look at it from the outside, it would not, by appearances, appear to be this horrible place. You know, if you Google a picture of Lubyanka, you would look at it and say, oh, it's kind of a nice old building. And it was this old hotel that was converted into this horrid place, about 2 blocks or so from Red Square, if memory serves. And
yeah, he talks about hearing the bells ringing from the Kremlin. That's how he kept time. So yeah,
time. And an interesting point is he speaks about in one interview how one of the only places that Mass was occurring in Moscow at the time was in the church across the street. Insofar as they did allow the Catholic diplomats who were assigned to the USSR to attend Mass. Now, the NKVD would stand at the front door to make sure there were no locals, there weren't other people coming in, but I couldn't help but think such terrible irony that here you have this priest, mostly in solitary confinement for the course of 5 years, deprived of the sacraments, celebrating them and receiving them, and the only place in town that we knew for sure public Mass was occurring was literally across the street.
what happened to him within the Lubyanka? I mean, did they torture him?
Hoses, ropes, they beat him, they put his head in a vice, they would drug him with heroin.
Seriously.
The most horrible things. And he finally, and this is another part of his life that is so touching and so emotional as it's presented. When he finally, as they say, he said, I was doped. He was drugged, and as he was drugged and enduring these beatings, he confessed to being a spy, something that wasn't true. And so it is part of Father Walter's story that, John, to go back to what you said at the beginning, he had his breaking point, and it was an extreme breaking point. And I'll share you the story. I had a chance to speak to, I'll just say, a very venerable priest, a priest venerable in age, who knew Father Walter pretty well and would celebrate Mass with him privately. And as they had finished celebrating Mass at Fordham, it was just he and Father Walter in the sacristy. And he said it was the most moving experience in his priesthood because as they were changing out of their vestments, Father Walter allowed this priest to see his back and to see the scars. And he described the deep wounds in his back. And he allowed him just to touch his shoulder. And he said, I put my hand to his shoulder and felt the wounds from Lubyanka. He said, and I realized the connection to the scourging of Christ. How in such a profound way, Father Walter's life becomes identifiable with our Lord, Christ the priest, especially at the scourging in the wounds that he bore.
Well, and how that priest got to identify with Thomas in a certain sense, because seeing and touching is believing beyond anything that words can describe. So I've never heard of anyone having that kind of an experience, but wow, that's utterly fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So what does he learn about God's will in all of this? You know, most of us kind of think that God's will is out there and we just need to discern what God's will is. What does he learn about God's will in his imprisonment and confinement?
You want to take it, Father, or do you want me to?
John, I'm doing a lot of the talking. We could go
No.
back and forth. I'll wrap up.
Sure. And correct me if I'm wrong. I will leave it to the esteemed cleric to correct my theology on this. But I think that it's one of the reasons why I say that Father Walter is for everybody, and especially for young people as well. I think God gives you free will, and you need to make a decision with your life, right? And so God will give you the lights. He will point you in directions, but he doesn't have a plan for you in the sense of it's all, I should have been a priest instead of a husband, or something to that effect, right? The will of God is the persons, places, and experiences that you encounter every day of your life. And how do you react to them then? So God puts you in this place. He puts us together right now having this conversation. Well, am I going to cooperate with his grace? Am I going to be open to what he has to teach me through these other people I'm talking to? I think that's what Father Walter would say. God's will is. And so no matter where you are in life, at what stage of your life, at a point of a decision, or even just at a point of the slog of doing your job every day, that's God's will for you at that moment and at that time. And seeing God in that, cooperating with him in that, and doing what he wants us to do is the Christian life, and suffering what he wants us to endure, or loving those he wants us to love. I think that would be kind of in a nutshell what Father Walter would say God's will is, and how we should understand that.
It's people think, oh my gosh, I'm stuck in this traffic jam. Where is the will of God in this traffic jam? The will of God is the traffic jam.
Yeah.
And you then have to discern, how are you going to cooperate with that moment? How are you going to turn that into a moment of grace? Your kids are driving you up a wall. Your pastoral counsel is just driving you to distraction and an early grave. Whatever happens to us in life, that's God's will for you, whether it be his passive will or his active will. It's his will for you in that moment. And then what do you do with that? Would that be correct, Father, or is that?
I would definitely talk about, God's permissive will. Why it answers some questions of theodicy. What comes across for me clearly with Father Walter, you talk about the grace sufficient coming from Christ, is truly, I would wrap it up in the sense of God's providence. That for all eternity, it was somehow in the mind of God that there was this providential nature that allowed what will it take for Walter Chisek, the boy from Shenandoah, to become Walter Chisek in the presence of God, the saint, on whom we call out for help in intercession. And he develops this keen understanding of God's providence in his life, both in Lubyanka and finally after the 5 years when he's sent north into Siberia for the 10 years of hard labor in Norilsk. And I like to refer to that as his frozen purgatory. This was his purgation. This was a man working out his salvation in the most extreme and terrible circumstances. But he understands all of it in terms of God's providential care for him, that he was there for a reason. He was the one that was, he talks about meeting the other political prisoner priests. And I love when he's talking about the priests and how he says, the evil that they experienced was as real to them as the barbed wire fences that surrounded them. I remember that image just kind of ingrained in my head, thinking this was so real for them in this mind. And yet he understood that God was holding them in his providential care, that somehow this was how they were asked to work out their salvation. And he did so heroically, which is why we're talking about him today.
Now, he spends, did you say 5 years in Lubyanka?
Mm-hmm.
So 5 years in Lubyanka, and it is solid. It's almost the entire time is solitary confinement, correct?
Yes, when they took him out of his cell, he talked about being with Nazis and murderers, but he was, for the most part, he was in solitary confinement. It was a real desolation for him.
Wow.
It's also interesting to see in his solitary confinement, something to talk about how he's every man's saint, is how even in this desolation, you call it, he develops a rule of life. He goes back to his Jesuit training. He develops a pattern of prayer, the prayers of the rosary, Marian devotion, offering the prayers of the Mass without the ability to consecrate bread and wine. And he really develops a pattern of life for himself, which is something for all of us, that no matter where we are in our lives, no matter what vocation God has called us to, as Catholics, we're asked to develop a pattern for our lives. I'm sure, as a father, prayers with children, as a priest, the prayers of the office, the commitment to Mass, the Eucharist, devotion to Our Lady, he also shows us that plan. And again, he does it in the worst of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So while he's at the Lubyanka, you talk about this breaking point. Was it something where he's forgiving of himself after he has this breaking point, or is he desolate? What's his state of mind? What's the state of his soul even?
You know, there's a indication in the books that there was this moment, but it was a brief moment of desolation whereby the thought of suicide even crossed his mind, but he didn't stay there. And that's the key. I think he threw it back on Christ, and he says some very profound words, and I believe He Leadeth Me. He says, it was not the Soviets on trial in Lubyanka. It was not me, God versus the Soviets or anything. It was God versus Walter Ciszek. And he said he was tested in a fire that was as close to the fire of hell itself, you know. And so he really, it's like that last, when we speak of praying for a happy death, or we talk about the last sacraments, receiving those as a final fortification. It seems like Father Walter experienced something of that in for a fleeting moment. This is a chance for Satan to gain a soul, you know, or steal a soul away from God. But he didn't stay there. It was literally passing. His faith was such that he realized what this was about. It's not about me. It's about you, Lord. Let me become immersed in you, and let me give myself totally to you and depend on you completely. And it seems like at that moment, this burden was lifted. And ever since then, you know, even when he was threatened with death in subsequent interrogations, after all of that, he was at ease. He didn't, it was a different person. It wasn't him trying to be tough. And he says that, why? Because I took myself out of it. I just left it all to God. And so I think that's a fundamental moment for him, and very complicated and hard to get in someone's soul. We can only get what he tells us in the books, I think. But I think what he tells us is pretty profound. So
I view that moment as a paradigm shift in his life.
Right.
Because, you know, as I mentioned, God using all of even the difficult parts of his personality. And you're right, finally, there's this moment where he is momentarily, I think perhaps for the first time in his life, he's not able to do it.
Yeah.
You know, where it gets the best of him. And I mean, and it literally took torture, imprisonment, and being drugged to get to that point. You know, you could almost open the book of Job and you read through the trials there. God tried him in the fire. It's a kind of almost a John of the Cross, dark night of the soul moment. And he comes to this point, and I think it's the paradigm shift, because from that point on, he's set on mission. That's where you begin to see the development of his understanding of God's providential care.
So he goes from the Lubyanka to Siberia. He's there for 10 years. He's with the most evil of the evil. He's surrounded by this fence of evil, as you say. After Siberia, what happens to him then? Does he just get to go back to the United States, or is he kept in Russia?
No, he's kept in Russia for several more years, but I would note Norilsk is 10 degrees north of the Arctic Circle. Just to give you an idea of where he is on the globe, it's not just that he's in Siberia in the north, he's in the north of Siberia. In truly that frozen hell. But when they released him for a time, he met another priest in Norilsk. I love the scene in He Leadeth Me, where he walks out of prison. You know, it's the first time he's, you know, quote unquote, a free man, not that he really was, but he was outside of the confinement of prison in about 15 years. He actually finished his sentence a little early because he met his work quotas early, which is just another mind-boggling aspect of this man, that in these circumstances, he actually surpassed his quotas and was given a few months of an early release. One of the priests he met in that mine was living in Norlisk, and he talks about leaving with literally just the clothes on his back. Again, being held in God's providential care, and he seeks out this other priest whom he, stays at his home and then, begins to rebuild his life. John, I don't know if there's anything you want to comment about during that period before we can maybe go on to Abakan and the other places.
Sure. He, no, you're absolutely right, Father. And I'm not sure if this was what I was going to say in terms of his work quotas. He again had this idea, I'm not working for the communists. Some people were sabotaging some of the work and, that sort of thing. His view was, look, the Lord has given me this situation. I am going to work as best as I can for him. And I realize that what I do will benefit someone. And therefore, I'm going to do the best I can. Hence his quotas, hence being a superb worker. You see him when he comes back and he's got these hands, that are workman's hands and whatnot. I think, and I'm not sure if it was Abakan or somewhere else, but he actually got an award. And it has a very communist name. He was like the shock troop of communist labor or something like that. It was probably, he couldn't take it back to the United States with him, but he kind of had that glimmer in his eye and smiled when he talked about it. It's like, yeah, the shock troop of communist labor. And so it just shows his putting everything, seeing everything with the eyes of God, essentially, and acting accordingly. So, yeah.
It seems to me that if he believes that the will of God is the here and now, that we're supposed to cooperate with that in the here and now, and that we just rely on his providence, we provide, he fills in the rest. Why wouldn't he have completed his work quotas to such a prodigious extent that he gets released early? Why wouldn't he have won this worker award? Because he would have just given his all. He would have given his best. Am I wrong? And
it would also fall in line with the other things he did while he was in prison there in Norilsk, up in the mine in Siberia. Because there you also have to, you can't just, his work is one thing, but he's still ministering as a priest. And one of the remarkable parts of this, and you talk about God's providential care, is he meets the first other priest he gets to interact with in 5 years after imprisonment. He meets him in the mine. He's another priest, political prisoner, and they save a little bit of bread and they save some of the raisins, the prisoners, and they boil them and ferment them and make a little bit of wine. And he talks about was at the back of a men's watch and the little shot glass they use. And for the first time in 5 years as a priest, he was able to celebrate Mass in the mine. And it talks about how he would fast from midnight, which was the rule then, the night before, until he was able to celebrate Mass the next day. If he was able to celebrate Mass the next day, like he would even deprive himself of the meager nutrition that they had to be faithful to church law and to be able to carry out the sacrifice of Mass for those prisoners. And imagine, just being caught, having your confession heard, offering sacramental absolution. He heard confessions in the mine. They would give retreats.
Really?
Places. It was about Eucharistic sacrifice. I still remember talking about Russia, just generally, how many babies did you baptize? He said, I stopped counting after 3 years when we reached about 800.
Wow.
Yeah.
Priests could go a lifetime and not baptize, 800.
One of those, and Father, you probably know this, but one of those baptized children, and I can't remember where it was. It might have been in Abakan at this point, so there's limited freedom he has. He can't go to the big cities.
Where is Abakan? Is it the Kamchatka Peninsula or where?
It's kind of near Mongolia, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
You're out of Siberia.
Yes, exactly. So after he leaves Siberia, he where he's doing all these things, as Father said, he continues to do that, but he's working these various jobs. He's this town called Krasnoyarsk, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Then Abakan is the final stop. But in one of those towns, he's doing the same thing, and he's baptizing children, and he's doing this you're going to people's homes, they're drawing the blinds, they're sending the other kid out to play because they don't want the KGB to know about this. And one of those instances happened in 1951. family sends the little one out, who is about 3 years old, the older brother. He validates their marriage. Father Walter validates this couple's marriage and then baptizes their child. The child they baptize ends up becoming a Franciscan priest. That Franciscan priest was then the very last bishop named by John Paul II before he died. And he's now a bishop in Russia. And I can't, Father, you might know where, but as a memento of that day for his baptism, Father Chiswick gifted the child and the family a little silver cross, just bent metal that they would have had, in whatever manual labor job he might have had or the folks might have had up there. And this bishop still carries that to this day. Very thankful that Father Walter's sacrifice, because it brought him into the faith, and he's now a bishop. So it really is an amazing story that you have this, bishop of the successor of the apostles as a result of the sacrifice of this tough kid from Shenandoah.
Now, how is it that he gets to return to the United States?
A prisoner exchange.
Let me ask you first real quick. What was he doing in Abacan for? Because he had to have had a job of some sort. So what was he doing for a job? But then how did he get back to the United States?
He was working as an auto mechanic, the most part. I mean, he had several jobs. As you look all throughout his life, he did logging, mining. He worked in some of the shops, associated with the mine in Norlisk. But I think in Abacan, he was working as an auto mechanic at a gas station, essentially.
Yeah.
And there he really was laying low, because they had a very tight watch on him in Abacan, because he was finally out of Siberia. He was out of prison. So he talks about going out into the countryside, out of the city, and ministering, behind closed doors there. But in Abacan, he wasn't known as a priest. Even to his friends, he did not reveal his priesthood. He would offer mass in his room. He would say his office. He talks about that in some of his writings about Abacan. But really in Abacan, even amongst his closest of friends, they did not know him as a priest.
So then he is working as this auto mechanic. He's probably thinking he's going to stay in the USSR for the rest of his life, maybe. And how is it that he gets to come back home to the U.S.?
Well, when he was released from prison, he was allowed to write to his sisters. This is what made me think the two sisters. It was the first anyone had heard from him since before the war. They had long presumed him dead, but they knew he was alive. They knew he was there, and so there was this plea made, to the State Department under Kennedy. So you have your first Catholic president, so to speak, and there's a prisoner exchange. And they bring him to Moscow. And I remember many years ago when I first read With God in Russia, recounting his last few days, almost the KGB trying to impress him on just how good communism is and see what this has brought about. And he could see through them, a mile away, of course. But he's brought to the airport, and it's one of those, it's really a scene from a movie. You talk about James Bond, it's the scene from the movie. They bring him to the airport, and the agent of the State Department says, "You're Father Chiswick." And it's the first time anyone, I think, had addressed him in English like that since his ordination. He said, "Father, I'm here to take you home."
Wow.
And I love the scene as he's leaving. Two things about his departure that always strike me. How as they take off, just again, the clothes on his back, they take off from Moscow, and God's providence, and he looks at what has just come to an end. And I can't even fathom what was taking place at this point. You're looking at, 16, 17 plus years now. You're talking about 15 in confinement and many more years than after. But he makes the sign of the cross out the window of the plane over the Kremlin. And it concludes, it's just that sign of the cross over Russia just kind of brings to its culmination, its fulfillment, his service in Russia. And my favorite picture of the many pictures of him, I love the picture of his ordination day. The picture where he's a prisoner in Lubyanka is very, very moving, as you see him in his prison robes and head shaved. But my favorite picture of him is at what's now JFK at Idlewild, where his niece was married that day. I saw his niece about a year and a half ago, who looks remarkably like him. A wonderful lady. It was her wedding day. They went from the wedding reception to the airport. One of the Bernadine sisters is pictured. His sister, whose daughter had just been married, I believe it was, has him by one arm, locked in, and the other sister, in her full Bernadine habit of that era, has him locked in by the other arm. And there's just this unbridled joy on their faces. And he is in the middle in his overcoat and hat. Of course, there's media there, there's press there, flashes going off. The look on his face in that picture says 1,000 words. What just happened?
Yeah.
So he gets released. He's back in the United States, and he goes off to a cottage on a lake and just kicks his feet up for the rest of his life. Is that what happened?
Not at all.
So what did happen then?
Well, we could talk about, Fordham University, the Institute for Christian Studies is tied to Wernersville. John, how about I'll fill in color for you? I've done a lot of the...
Yeah, sure. The first place they go after the airport is to America House in New York City, where he has in his broken, now at this point it's kind of broken English.
Mm-hmm.
He has a meal of pig and eggs, so bacon and eggs. So they had mass and they had breakfast. And after that, they took him to Wernersville, the Jesuit novitiate there, where he was going to kind of decompress and stay, and it's closer to the family and that sort of thing. And so when he pulled up, it was a great recollection. Father Dominic Maruca, S.J., he'd be in his 90s now. He recounts, he was the novice master at the time, and he recounts that all the young guys are lined up as Father Walter pulls up. And a lot of them, this is a man of lore, right? They had been praying for the repose of his soul since 49. So who is this guy? Went into Russia, and now he's back, right? They all line up, and Father stopped Father Maruca, and he said, "Can I say a few words to these young men?" The floor is yours, right? And one of the first things he did was he says, "Gentlemen, do not discount what you are being trained to do here, how to pray, how to live your life, how to order your life, because what I learned here is what got me through the darkest days in Russia." And so a testament to the training, especially the spiritual training in prayer, whereby he could keep his mental equilibrium, his psychological equilibrium, and in his faith. And so just reinforcing that, can you imagine being one of those young Jesuit novices in 1963, one of the first people that this man coming back from Russia is speaking to, and reinforcing, the discipline that they were undergoing at that point, when many of them were probably like, do I really need to do this? Or, this is, trust me, it'll come back and pay off, So that was a fascinating story. He does his retreat after staying there for some time. And then, as Father said, he's assigned to Fordham University in the John the 23rd Center for Eastern Christian Studies. I think it was called the Russian Center originally, but then they changed some names along the way. And that's pretty much where he spent the rest of his life, where he was assigned at least.
And he would give retreats. He would give talks. His retreat notes we still have, very deep, very profound, but at the same time also very real, very practical. Many of the Jesuits, my first 8 years of priesthood was spent within a short driving distance to Wernersville at 2 different parishes, and it was wonderful to be able to go there not only for retreat but for a day of recollection, spiritual direction, confession. The Jesuits who were there would always make reference to him and his presence there. I remembered one night eating dinner with the Jesuit priest community there, as I was privileged to do on a number of occasions. And one of them came back with just a cup of hot water instead of coffee or tea or anything. And I said, "Just hot water, Father," sitting next to me, and this older priest. And he said, "Yes." He said, "It's something I learned from Walter." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes." He said, most often at the end of dinner, he would come over with a cup of hot water and just put it on the table, and he would drink it and enjoy it. And I asked him, why just hot water? Why nothing in it? And he said, it was just something I got used to. And he said, just in that moment, that little moment, you could see the evidence of his life in something just that simple. So every once in a while at the end of a meal, to this day, I picked up just a little hot water.
And on that note, Father, if I can interject, the young man who's now in his 70s, pushing 80, who he came back from Russia with, Dr. Marvin McKinnon, is at the University of Chicago now.
Okay.
He also was in the Gulag, but for 2 years, I think. It wasn't as much as Father Walter, but some of the same type of cuisine, was served. And Father and he always maintained this relationship throughout the rest of his life, and he'd come to visit, and they'd visit each other, etc. And if they were having tea or something like that, right before Father would pour the hot water, he would turn to him and say, "Kipiatok," which is the Polish or the Russian word for hot water, because that's what they drank. They didn't have coffee or tea; they drank hot water. And so it was kind of they'd wink at each other, and it's kind of like a little joke between them, a very, very personal type of touch that Father would do with, in this case, his fellow Gulag survivor, but that type of personal touch are the things that he would share with many others, just as the priest you experienced there, Father, back at Wernersville.
It kind of reminds me of that scene from the Count of Monte Cristo, where Jim Caviezel's character, he has this sumptuous, beautiful 4-post king-size bed, and someone comes into the room and finds him sleeping on the ground because that's what he had gotten used to.
Yeah.
He was in prison. So it makes perfect sense to me. So what year did Father Chiswick pass away? Go to his reward.
December 8th, 1984.
He was the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception.
Yes.
I remember that just because he was born on St. Charles Borromeo Day, and he died on the Our Lady's Great Solemnity in the Immaculate Conception. So
That's what a blessing. Now, I've been to Wernersville a pilgrimage there. First of all, it's a great treasure of a place in and of itself. But, I was surprised, given his notoriety, that his grave is just a simple headstone. It's not inside of a church. It's just very, very ordinary. Are there plans once he moves to, God willing, the venerable stage or what have you, to maybe move him inside of a church someplace, or what?
So right now, I'll just first comment on his grave, and then perhaps any future plans. His grave is a place of pilgrimage, and at the Jesuit Center to this day, still for now functioning as a retreat center, you will find students regularly praying at his grave. I have seldom gone to his grave, and it's a regular place that I visit, that I haven't found someone else already there, in all sorts of weather, at all times of year. And I'll share for you, just for myself, in terms of the significance of his grave, he was just buried in the next spot, as religious orders frequently do. It was whoever dies next goes into the next spot, and the Jesuit before him has the closest date before, the Jesuit after has the next closest date, and so on. There's almost a little lantern aside the grave. There's rosaries hung there for people to pray on, and I'll see people occasionally taking a little bit of dirt from around the headstone just to carry with them as something of a relic, so to speak, of him. In my first assignment, I would regularly visit there, and I would tell our parish secretary, who always wanted to know where you were. She was she's a wonderful woman who has since gone to her own reward. But the last question as you walk out the door is, "Father, where are you going?" And I just took to saying, "I'm going to visit my Uncle Walter. Oh, he's over in Wernersville." "Oh, okay." And she never asked any more about it. "Well, how's your Uncle Walter doing?" "It's about the same." Time, And this went on for a couple of years, that once a month or so, I don't take the afternoon and go see, the man I called Uncle Walter. And she finally looked at me. She said, you're going to Walter Chiswick's grave, aren't you? Yes, I am. But to say that now, afterward, there's certainly options that would be available. His home parish, the church building itself remains open, St. Casimir's, even as that area, Catholicism really constricting in terms of numbers, the area itself shrinking in terms of numbers. However, the effort to maintain his home parish is still there. It's a beautiful, beautiful old neo-Gothic church, a monument to his own ancestors, but the font at which he was baptized is still there. And pray God one day how wonderful it would be to see him potentially, and we're speaking, in terms of canonization, pray God, but how wonderful it would be.
Where does this cause stand at this moment?
So the
diocese of his cause, God, but have the papers gone to Rome? What's happening?
What's called the diocesan phase of the cause, the information and testimonies collected within the diocese is actually long since finished and sent to Rome. Other historical commissions and studies that were presented to look at his work within the Maryland province of Jesuits, to look at his time in Russia, to do some investigation. There were on-site visits made, things like that. So there were further historical commissions, and right now his case sits with the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. Bishop Schlert was recently updated on it at the recent ad limina of the bishops of our region just last year. And essentially what we're doing now is praying for a miracle, praying for a verifiable medical miracle, so to speak. There certainly have been countless people I've had the privilege to talk to since becoming co-postulator. People will call me and say, I sought Father Walter's intercession and this or that happened. And there are all of these wonderful things, and we seek his intercession and we ask for his help. And I have no doubt that he's interceding. But as of yet, I can't say that we say we've had this, something that could be proven impossible by medicine or scientific standards.
If people want to get involved with the cause, they want to help by donating, they want to keep up with news that's happening vis-a-vis the cause, how do they do that? Where do they go?
The official group that has been appointed to promote his cause is the Father Walter Ciszek Prayer League. They are an amazing group of dedicated individuals who have been at this not a long time. They're folks who are personally invested, and the cause would never be where it is without them and their support. And I could not ever thank them enough for the work that they do in promoting his cause. You would find them at ciszek.org, CISZEK.org. And I would encourage anyone watching to please go to the website, check out his life, the videos. If you're able to and have the means to donate to his cause, it would certainly be appreciated. And it's also a place, most importantly, for your own spiritual refreshment, where you could find his writings, you could order his books, you could find links to the videos that he has. One of my favorite videos of him is he actually appeared on a game show. John, I don't know if you
Oh yeah, it's great. It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. The I Have a Secret game show, and it had these dressed as priests, and one of them is Walter Ciszek. And the I Have a Secret is, I was imprisoned in the Gulag.
That's amazing.
So there he was. You talk. All of that is all of those great resources are available at ciszek.org.
You talk about his books, and John and I were talking off camera about this. The main book that John and I love so much is He Leadeth Me. He also has, With God in Russia and With God in America. But I'm good. There you go. Perfect.
There are, folks.
And so what I do is I keep 2 copies on hand. God in America. We've all got our Ciszek books. Woo! So anyway, I keep one where I can make annotations in it, but I always keep another copy in case I find someone who needs their life changed as well. I can just give it to them. And I don't doubt that if people get their hands on any one of his books, they're going to be doing the same things, because they're just such powerful works of theological art, if you will. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with me today. I really so very much appreciate what it is that you've done and what you're doing. And folks, if you need help, turn to Father Ciszek. He's going to help you. He'll pray for you, and his prayers will heal, comfort, and aid you. Again, gentlemen, thank you so much. I very much appreciate it, and God bless you, and good luck with the cause.
It's been a privilege to be with you both.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Father.
And thank you for being with us today on this episode of That Catholic Saints Guy. If you've liked what you've seen, please consider supporting us on Patreon. The link is down below. Subscribe, hit that subscribe button, maybe even smash it. Ring the little bell down there so you get notifications of the next episodes. Like it, share it, help spread the word if you would. And in the meantime, we'll see you next time on That Catholic Saints Guy.
Chisholm.
Father, you must be familiar with burials. Number 3, how do they bury people above the frost line? Number 3.
Well, they just dig graves. And
During the wintertime.
the wintertime, they dig graves, and just as here, but it's much harder to dig them.
Were you allowed to say Mass after you got out of prison?
After I was out, I could say Mass secretly.
Oh, then you did it without official permission.
No, you had to get permission, but I...
Oh, well, and then...
Is there a undercurrent, is there a desire for religion other than among the old people from the Tsarist days?
Well, among the young, there isn't.
Among the elderly?
Among the young, there isn't.
Among the young, there is not.
Can you give me one of the new names, number 3?
There's a Kigbe now.
And what is the NKVD?
MVD, that was just before they changed this name.
I see. Thank you.
Well, there you are, panel. Once again, time to vote, and if you will, please make a choice. Select on your ballots either number 1, number 2, or number 3. Most interesting story. Most interesting story. All right, are we all set?
No.
No.
I can't. It's
I
too
know,
old.
darling, it is not easy.
All right.
All right, may we start with Tom Poston. Tom, how'd you vote?
I voted for number 3. I must say, this is, gee, that's 20 years of his life for the sake of his religion and his work. That's really praiseworthy, I must say. Good for you.
Right, indeed. Peggy?
I voted for number 3. I don't know why, I just feel it is number 3.
All right. Orson?
I feel it's number 2, but for some bizarre reason I voted for number 1. I just don't, they're all, there's 2 of the best liars and one of the best real ones I've ever seen.
All right, Kitty?
I would like to add my congratulations, too, for this remarkable feat. And I voted for number 1 because Irkutsk, I think, is the capital of Siberia. And 2 and 3 didn't say that. They said it was in the north, but...
No, the East.
In the east, I mean.
Yes.
But I voted for number 1.
All right, there are the votes. I wonder how you at home feel about the way they voted. Well, let's find out now, if we can, which of these 3 gentlemen really spent more than 20 years behind the Iron Curtain. Will the real Father Walter Chiswick please stand up? This is so amazing a story. Father Chiswick, I am told, lived for all his years in Russia on a diet of soup and black bread. It is incredible to believe that for 15 years he ate no butter, no milk, no fresh fruit, and no meat. And I do think, Father, that so many of us would like to read your book. Would you once again give us its title and its publisher?
The title of the book is With God in Russia. It's just narrating the facts without any criticism or without any antagonism.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being with us. Congratulations to you on your return. Well, number 1, you really fooled them. You got 2 votes. Would you tell us who you are, sir?
My name is Mark Heenahan, and I'm in the advertising department at Sperry Rand Univac.
Very good. And number 2, you're an excellent fibber. Tell us about you, sir.
My name is Paul Goodyear. I'm a placement director with the Charles Prince Personnel Agency.
Thank you. Well, as you see, there have been 2 incorrect votes, which means a total of $500 for you to share. Thank you so very much, and good night. Right now, time out for a brief film, then back.
To Tell the Truth has been brought to you tonight by Tempo Filter Cigarettes. For taste too good to miss, Tempo. This is Johnny Olson speaking for To Tell the Truth, the program recorded.